I'm Brian. Welcome. Glad to have you here. We're doing some recording, so that's why I'm not going to ask you if you bought any drugs or sold any drugs. So, welcome to the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center. I'm going to be sharing some stories and some facts about the two artists who lived here. And I often say I already know everything I'm going to say, so your questions and comments will be quite welcome, and corrections if you feel necessary. Last Sunday I had a curator from the National Gallery, and his friend told me at the end of the tour that that's who he was, and I went, oh my God, I hope I didn't say something wrong. Anyway, welcome. We're going to talk mostly about the two artists, Jackson Pollock and Lee Krasner, and but basically all they were was artists. They had no children. They participated in the community, but their lives were their art, so we can't really talk about them without talking about art. But first, let me just describe this beautiful property we're on. There are 5 buildings. The house over there, which we'll go in at the end of the tour. The outside looks not all that different. It's about 150 years old. It hasn't changed that much over the years. The brown shingle building over there was a garage. The exterior looks pretty much like it did when Krasner and Pollock lived here. It's been converted, and now there's 2 modern offices in there. And there's also a restroom, which you're welcome to use if you need that. The white building where you checked in was a shed, and it sort of still is. We have some books in there. If you are interested in collect art books, there's some things that you would not find at Barnes & Noble. So have a look when we're done, if you're interested. Their little outhouse. At the time, outhouses weren't a sign of poverty. Everybody had one. And then probably the reason you came, the studio over here. Most of the what I call signature paintings that Pollock did, the pour paintings, were done in that building. He did a lot of work before that, much of it in New York. I almost said Los Angeles. And some here. But all of the signature work, the pour paintings that we think about when we think of Jackson Pollock were done in that building. And we'll go in there and see the floor with a lot of splatters and spills that happened when he was creating that art. That building, originally when they bought the property in 1945, was on the concrete slab behind me. They moved it for 2 reasons. One was, as you can see, you're looking at a multi-million-dollar view, and with that building, which isn't really, it's not ugly, but it really doesn't enhance this view. But the main reason was to rotate the building so that the sunlight didn't shine into the studio. Most artists do not like sunlight because when it's shining in, the light's quite different than the rest of the day, and the colors that they're using and so forth, it's hard to work that way. So when we go in there, you'll see a large window facing that way that lets in a lot of light, but never the sunlight. So he moved it over there. In the interim, from when they bought this in the fall of 1945 until he started working over there, which was 6 or 8 months, he painted up in the corner bedroom, and we'll see that when we go in the house. So again, I'm going to remind you, I'm expecting questions. So let's start with Paul Jackson Pollock. That was his given name. He must have thought Jackson was cooler than Paul, so we know him as Jackson Pollock. He was the 5th of 5 boys, born in 1912 in Cody, Wyoming. His father was sort of hunted around and find ways to make money to support his family. He did some road work. Some people call him an engineer. I don't really think he was an engineer. But in any case, they didn't have tons of money by any means, but they had food on the table and a place to live. Not long, Pollock was a couple years old, they moved to Southern California. Most of the time they spent in Los Angeles, my hometown, and sometime in San Diego, a little bit of time in Arizona, but mostly in Los Angeles. What I try to do sharing these stories with visitors such as you all is share some things that, first off, that Pollock shared with us and that probably influenced his work. And the same with Lee when we're talking about her. So what happened in Los Angeles? Well, probably the most influential experiences were in a place called Manual Arts High School. Manual Arts has been there for many years. It still is. We played them in sports and usually lost. It's a big urban high school in Los Angeles. And Pollock was a horrible student. He didn't come anywhere near graduating. In fact, he got kicked out a couple of times. But he had a really special experience with the art teacher that he had. And this guy, one of the things that he had the students do, was find a piece of glass. It could be a mirror, a glass pane, something that they could find, put it horizontal and pour liquids on it. Pour some motor oil, pour some pancake syrup, some gasoline, whatever they wanted, and watch how the fluids interacted with each other and found their own position, which planted the seed of where he ended up doing the pour paintings. Another thing that was quite influential is the teacher said, I don't want you to paint a picture of this tree. I want you to paint a picture of how this tree makes you feel. And this inner emotions and subconscious motivation was in all of Pollock's work his entire life. That was a very important thing to Mr. Pollock. Another thing that he did, not with this teacher, but he did in Southern California. One other thing that he shared, yeah, please help yourself, that he shared with us was what we called, when I was a kid, Indian sand painting. That's probably not a very respectful way of describing it, but that's what they called it and what we called it when I was in third grade. The native people took colored sand and would create images by letting go of the sand, letting it fall. And these images were for ancestors who'd passed on. And so there are two significant things about that. It didn't matter if a living person saw it, because it wasn't for a living person. And they were completely ephemeral. If the wind blew them away 5 minutes later, it's okay, because grandma saw it, or whomever saw it, and that's all that mattered. But again, it was letting go of the medium and letting it fall and creating an image of a message to a loved one who had passed on. Another thing that happened, or began to happen in Southern California and influenced Pollock throughout his career, was exposure to three of the great Mexican muralists, Siqueiros, Orozco, and Diego Rivera. These were artists who were depicting the Mexican Civil War, and many of them were images of regular, average people suffering during this period of combat. And Pollock shared with us that it just astounded him and motivated him that you could take a piece of cloth, a canvas, and some pigment, and create these images of these people that make you want to cry. This just really motivated him that an artist could do that. Now, keep in mind, he's 15, 16 when he's seeing these, but this was really very motivating to Jackson. So he was having these experiences in Los Angeles. In the late 20s, very late 20s, because the crash had happened and the Depression had started, he and two of his brothers, Sandy and Charles, and Charles actually evolved into a pretty well-known artist himself. If you're really interested in Pollock, you should search Charles Pollock when you get home and look at some of his work. It's really quite good. Anyway, the three of them decided they didn't have any money, they didn't have any education. What the hell, let's go to New York. So they piled in Charles' old Buick and they drove to New York. They didn't have any money. It's like, why not? So they did. So luckily for us, and I had a professor who said there's no such thing as luck. You make your own pathway. In any case, Jackson quickly got involved with the Art Students League. You're familiar with the Art Students League? It's on West 57th Street, still very much alive and well. And are you a student there?
57th Street, yes.
Okay, well, you know what I'm talking about. And I'd encourage you, if you have 5 minutes, there's always a student show. It's not really on the ground floor because you have to walk up a half flight. But there's a large gallery, and I view it sort of like a thrift shop. There's maybe a fair amount of junk and a couple of jewels. And you'll see the next famous artist. So, but in any case, Pollock got engaged at the Art Students League fairly quickly. And he met and became very close with a guy named Thomas Hart Benton. Is that name familiar with any of you? Benton's art is at MoMA, it's at the National Gallery, it's at the Art Institute of Chicago and Metropolitan Museum. But he's probably better known as an instructor, as an art teacher. And he obviously saw Pollock's talent, even though the masterpieces that we're familiar with, the Pour paintings, was 10 years in the future. Benton saw the talent in this guy. They became close. In fact, Pollock lived with Benton and his wife, and I think he had 2 daughters for a while he was sort of getting his feet on the ground in New York. One of the things about the art community we're talking the early and mid 1930s, the art community was pretty small. I'm guessing there were maybe 50 artists actually making a living as artists, and they knew each other. You could know 50 people. Now, there are hundreds of artists in New York and Los Angeles and Chicago and in Texas and other places that are completely legitimate artists supporting themselves. You could never know all those people, but they could. Most of them were in New York, and they went to each other's openings, and they went drinking together, and they knew each other. And through Thomas Hart Benton, Pollock was sort of fast forwarded into this crowd, and got to know the artist community pretty quickly. And as a result of that, or one of the results of that, was his being invited to be in a show. There was a curator who, his name was John Graham, and he decided to put on a show, and he had a gallery. He didn't actually have a gallery, but he would stage shows in other people's galleries, and he was pretty well known. So if he came to you and said, I have this idea for a show, the gallery owner would let him do it. So in this particular case, he wanted to do, in this particular gallery, had a front gallery, and a back gallery. So the title of the show was French and American Painting. And in the front room, he had some famous paintings. Picasso, Cézanne, Mondrian level work. And in the back, he had 12 emerging American artists. And he had invited Pollock to be one of these. So this is the first time Pollock is in a legitimate gallery with legitimate artists in company. And as I say, there were in the back room, there were 12 Americans who were included in this. Pollock, and another one of them was a woman named Lee Krasner. And Lee was the ultimate networker. She really worked the room. And she wanted to know everybody and what everybody was doing, and she probably fair to call her a control freak to the degree that she could influence what was happening. She wanted to do that. So she was one of the artists, and she looked over the list, and she saw 10 people that she knew. 11th was herself, and this guy, Jackson Pollock, who's he? So the story is that she went over to his apartment, knocked on the door and said, "I'm Lee Krasner. We're in this show together. Who are you?" Any of you seen the movie Pollock with Ed Harris? Yeah. Okay, well, that's depicted in that. Now, I said the story is, Lee told us that's when they met. Historians are totally confident that they had to have met before that. They all went to the same openings. They were both students at the Art Students League. They actually were both involved in the Works Project Administration, President Roosevelt's program to stimulate the economy. But Lee told us that that's when they met, and I think I think it's very fair and reasonable to say that's when they spiritually met and started to become a couple. That's fine, nothing wrong with that. So let's run the clock back to 1908 in Brooklyn, where Lenore Krasner is born. Her father had come from what is now eastern Ukraine, or at least when I last looked, it was part of eastern Ukraine. And he immigrated to the United States about 2 years before that, got settled, got a job. He actually opened a little store. And then he sent for his wife, and at the time, 4 children, and a son and 3 daughters. They had a 5th child who died fairly young. So Mrs. Krasner and those 4 kids came over and settled in Brooklyn with Mr. Krasner. And again, the story is that exactly 9 months after she arrived, Lee was born. And then there was one more sister after that. So Lee and her sister were the 2 American citizens. The others became naturalized later, but they were born here in the outskirts of Brooklyn. So now she became Lee Krasner. I'm sure particularly the women here will appreciate if she signed a painting, Lenore Krasner, indicating that a woman did this, it would be worth a fraction, the exact same painting. So many artists either just put Frankenthaler or Krasner or Lee Krasner being an androgynous name to try to avoid that, although everybody found out. And it's still the case. Women artists it's hard to say what's an equivalent painting. Paintings are unique things, but in any case, that's why she became Lee. And so a few stories I like to tell about Lee. One is she was asked once, "When did you decide to become an artist?" And her answer was, "I'm a woman. I did not decide to be a woman. I'm an artist. I did not decide to be an artist." This was how core being an artist was to her. And she really lived that. Another indication of who Lee Krasner was, when she started to get close to high school age, she researched and found that there was one high school in all of New York that would accept women into a arts program. Now, keep in mind she was born in 1908, so this is probably 1920 or 1921. She's making this determination. So she applied to Washington Irving, which, by the way, is still there in Manhattan. She was turned down once. Her tenacity kicked in. She applied again and was accepted. And somehow this little girl got herself from the outskirts of Brooklyn to Washington Irving High School, back and forth for 4 years, and graduated from there in the art program. The idea of this little girl back and forth on the subway is, to me, very impressive. She graduated from there. She went on to the National Academy of Design, got a bachelor's degree from there, and she actually taught there for a while. She participated in the Works Project Administration. You're all familiar with that. I don't think it would happen today, but they actually, not only did they pay artists, they paid everybody. If you were a plumber, go plumb something, we'll pay you. If you were all the wonderful stone walls in Connecticut and Massachusetts, those were all built under WPA sponsorship. Interesting thing in the art program, not only did they sponsor artists, but you could be a sculptor, You could be what they called an easel artist, which meant you made paintings that would fit on an easel, or you could be a mural artist. And the interesting thing was, if you were an easel artist, you had a quota. You had to do so many paintings a month to get your stipend. But if you're a mural artist, like murals are huge, there was no quota. So Pollock got into the program as a mural artist. We're not aware of a single mural that he ever did, but he didn't have a quota. So that's sort of a little bit about, a little insight into Jackson. So we're back to Mr. Graham's exhibit, French and American painting, and these two meet there. And Pollock is now sort of officially in the art community in New York. So we're going to skip now to 1942. At this point, I'd like to point out three women that were very, very influential in Pollock's life. One was his mother. And from a young age, she was very supportive and encouraging of him being an artist. And I don't know about now, or certainly question 100 years ago, a mom wanting her son to be an artist. You know, you want your son to be a lawyer or a doctor or businessman, but an artist, well, she did. She was very supportive of that all the way through his whole life. The second was Lee. She was very supportive in two ways. I sort of categorize it as the negative stuff and the positive stuff. The negative stuff was dragging him home from the bars, literally getting him out of jail. There's one incident where he was so drunk he fell into a snowbank and probably would have died if she hadn't dragged him home. So that kind of babysitting. But the positive was she was his best advocate. She, as I said, she worked the room for him. She always painted. There was never a period when she didn't do anything, but her output dropped significantly when he was sort of getting started. She worked to pay the rent and worked the room, so to speak, to promote him. And there wasn't a lot of time left for her own work, although she made some time. The third person was Peggy Guggenheim. You probably know that name. Peggy was Solomon Guggenheim. Solomon is the one who built the wonderful museum in Manhattan with the spiral. Peggy was his niece. Her father was Benjamin, one of 13 boys in the Guggenheim family. And he only had two children, Peggy and her sister. The reason is that Benjamin Guggenheim and his wife went down on the Titanic. So they were not obviously able to have any more children. The Guggenheims tended to have large families, but he died, so that was that. Peggy and her sister each inherited $5 million. I would love to have $5 million, but in today's economy, that doesn't make you super wealthy. For a young woman 100 years ago to have, a single young woman to have $5 million, coupling that with, we're talking about Peggy Guggenheim, who had an amazing insight into art. She had an amazing insight into artists, and she was an incredible business person. So you put that all together and throw in $5 million, and you have a really interesting career. Peggy, in 1942, called what's called an open call. And what that means is, if you have an open call, you have to designate a space. She rented a big studio space in Chelsea. And you invite artists to bring usually one piece to submit, and then a jury, which might be the person, or they might get a couple of friends to help. And they usually pick 10 or 15 paintings that'll be in a show at their gallery. So Peggy did this. And Pollock submitted something called Stenographic Figure, one of my favorite paintings. It's owned by MoMA. It's usually up if you're there. It's not actually up right now, but it's usually up. It's a easel painting. It's about this big, brush painted vertically, traditional. There's a frame on it. We'll talk about why there are not frames on most of Pollock's work. When we're in the studio, I'll address that. But this one has a frame. I think you can really see where he was going. But it's sort of messy. So he brings it in, and Peggy had two criteria. One, we don't totally understand, was the artist had to be younger than 40. So we figured there was someone who was 40 that she didn't want in, or whatever, it doesn't matter. The other one was it had to be a new painting. Couldn't be something that had been in a show or, something new, something you just did. So Pollock had just done stenographic figures, so he brought it in. The story is that Peggy looked at it and thought it was junk, sort of put it out of her mind, because there's like 150 paintings, and she's got to pick 15 of them to go in her gallery. But she had a really star-studded group of judges, including Pete Modrian. You probably know Modrian's work, very graphic, bold primary colors. And he had become quite famous in Europe. He left because of the Nazi regime and came to the United States and became equally famous here. So we're talking 1942. In 1942, if you were making a list of the 5 top living artists, he'd be on that list. So Peggy has looked at stenographic figure and what is this? Get that out of here. But then she looked over, and Modrian apparently had this habit. If he was contemplating something, he would stroke his chin like this. So he's standing in front of a stenographic figure, not saying anything, just staring at it. Peggy walks over. Why are you looking at that? And he said, "This is the most interesting thing I've seen in North America." Nothing better could happen to an artist at that point than a famous artist saying something like that about somebody who at that point nobody had ever heard of. The small artist community were starting to know him, but collectors and art historians, nobody knew Pollock at that point. So Peggy, being the insightful, smart business person, changes her mind real fast and takes him on as an artist. Do you know the name Larry Gagosian? Or he's one of the global, huge art gallerists. Becoming a Peggy Guggenheim artist would be like an artist being taken by Larry Gagosian today. That's it, you're done. All you have to do is make paintings. They're, again, very insightful into art. You have a stamp of approval among collectors. They'll do all the marketing. All you have to do is continue to be brilliant with creating art. So he becomes a Guggenheim artist. He's now in her gallery, which was called The Art of the Century, which was pretty famous. And his career is pretty much launched at that point. Now, the big elephant in the room is alcohol. Since young teenage years, this has been a big problem. And in fact, Pollock, this is a real question. Pollock knew it was a problem. He saw an internist, a general practitioner for many years, and he also saw various psychiatrists and psychologists trying to deal with his alcoholism. We probably all know that that's an extremely difficult disease to deal with, and he never really did, but he tried. Throughout his adult life, he saw various professionals to try to deal with this, but it was worse and worse. And all those guys, Franz Klein and de Kooning and all those guys, drank a lot, but they would go home from the Cedar Tavern, sleep it off, get up and perform, act like normal people the next day. Pollock wasn't able to do that. So he wasted a lot of time in drinking and being hungover. So one weekend, John Graham, the guy who did that first show, and his wife invited Lee and Jackson out here. They had a house out here to go to the Hamptons for the weekend. Well, who wouldn't want to do that? So they came out here, and Lee got the idea, wow, what if I got Jackson out here, away from the bars, away from his drinking buddies? He could spend a lot more time painting and less time drinking. So they found this house. Peggy Guggenheim loaned them $2,000. The price was $5,000, by the way, which I have to chuckle. I mean, renting something like this for the month of August would probably, I don't know, not even the month of August, for a week would be $5,000 now. But the price was $5,000. Peggy gave them loaned them two, and with that they were able to get a bank loan, and they bought this property. And in the fall of 1945, moved out here, and then he started painting out here. So, any questions? We're going to now go in the studio and see where he painted. Any questions or?
Do you think his mother was artistic? Living vicariously through him?
The only concrete thing that I know of is that she was a wonderful cook. And we actually published, I didn't have anything to do with it, but the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center published a cookbook. Pollock was a good cook too. And I mean, I have a copy of it, and there's some really good recipes in there. I don't know. That said, I don't think there's any evidence of her creating art, but she did nurture him. She understood what an artist is and nurtured him if that's what he wanted to do, and showed some talent. She was going to help him. So that's the best answer I could give you.
Did he come out here begrudgingly, or he was open to the idea?
I think he was fine with it. I mean, he saw this big studio that he could paint in, and it's beautiful out here. And you know, he wasn't the type of alcoholic that didn't want you to mess with it. There's no problem here. He recognized the problem. So the idea, well, maybe if we go out there, we'll get you away from the Cedar Tavern where all those artists went. I mean, that's an interesting question I've never been asked. But my guess is that he was okay.
He trusted his wife.
Yeah, maybe that's a really good idea. So.
Did he drink less as a result?
Initially, and actually there's a period of sobriety from early in 1948 until Thanksgiving of 1950, almost 3 years. And something that intrigues me very much, I was just mad at our director, the tall guy I was talking to. He just got his PhD in a subject on de Kooning, and I may just go back and get a doctorate in this. I think there's a really interesting study of Pollock's work when he was sober, and he was sober for 3 years. This isn't like no drinking for 2 weeks. This is enough for all the booze to get out of his system, and look carefully at the art before, during, and after. And then at the very end, like the last 3 years of his life, he is pickled, and didn't do very much, but he did some. So to look at that, I think would be really interesting. Anything else? Okay, we're going to walk over there. We'll go in the studio. Something we need to do is take your shoes off. We have some little foam booties extremely fashionable. You're going to want to keep them. Not. You need to put those on to go into the studio. It protects the floor. And you need to take your shoes off first. So let's go in there. There's some benches you can sit down and grab. There's some baskets with the booties. Just grab a pair for yourself. And while you're doing that, I'll make a few comments inside, and then we'll go see the floor. You may take photos, no flash. And if you would like a picture of your group, I'd be happy to take it.
Take our shoes off there?
In there, yeah.
Okay.
Brian, can you comment when we're looking at things, stuff he might have been done while he was sober versus less sober? Or is there any?
Well, there are a couple of pretty famous paintings that he did. My favorite is it's called number 31, which is at MoMA, and it is always up. And that was done during sobriety.
Okay. Yeah, I've seen that. Yeah. Okay.
I've just been pondering this idea
No,
of going to grad
you
school.
have a theory, and maybe there may be obvious sort of
Yeah.
manifestations of that.
Yeah.
And we'll read about it later after you do more research.
Yeah, yeah. I'm married to a neurologist, and
Right.
we've discussed the
The underpinnings.
impact of alcohol on the brain, which is significant. And how did that affect his creative process?
Yeah. I mean, and we all look at that wild.
Hi,
Take
come
the
on
shoes
in.
off here.
So, you know, and then after a little while he says, I know you're all looking at my
So while you're doing your costume change, I'll make a few comments. I always like to start off thanking Lee Krasner, because none of this stuff, most people would just throw this stuff out or sell it, or, it wouldn't be here for us to see. And Lee Jackson died in an automobile crash. You're probably aware of that. In 1956, August 11th, we're approaching the anniversary. And Lee lived to a ripe old age and passed in 1984. So she lived here for many years after his passing, and worked, as we'll discuss, worked in the studio after Pollock died. She moved over here and did her work. But all these things that are here, on the far wall, you'll see some paint cans that Pollock used, and many of these were Pollock's. That Lee kept because she guessed very correctly that we would want to look at them now, and in 50 years and 100 years, that people will still be looking at Pollock's work and where it happened, and sort of a little bit of the culture that helped it happen will be interesting to people. So thank you, Lee. The floor, for about half the time that Pollock was alive, was covered. Why? Well, look at this baseball game. I mentioned Sandy is one of the two brothers that came to New York with Pollock, with Jackson, and he went in the printing business, and he developed this product, a baseball game, sort of a precursor to a video game, and it has little pieces and you can play baseball on it. And he had a lot of them left over, so he gave a whole bunch of them, boxes and boxes, to Lee and Jackson, and they were both very frugal people. So one of the things they did, do we have the?
It's right over there.
we know of 17 paintings that Pollock did that are that exact size, and so we're like 99.9% sure that they were painted on the masonite. And this is one of them. You can just pass that around. Now, Pollock was known, if he ended up with a painting that he didn't like, and all artists end up with stuff that it didn't happen, he would burn them. Some artists paint over it, start over and just use it. Some artists try to sell it or whatever, but Pollock would burn them. So we know of 17 of those, but maybe there were others, who knows. And actually Lee used them also, and actually there's a nice one at the Philadelphia Museum. If you're ever there, one of Lee's painted on these. Mainly what they did with them was basically insulation. They covered this floor with them and painted it white, and you can see a picture of Lee with the white floor. That's after they did this sort of renovation of the studio. This is David, my colleague, and by the way, he will be here all afternoon. So after the tour, we're not going to be able to spend enough time in there that you're going to want. So, but you're more than welcome to come back over, and David knows everything I know and more, so he can help you with questions if you have any. So please feel free to come back if you'd like. What they did was they covered the floor with the masonite panels and then painted it white, and that was for insulation and to create a nice smooth floor. You can't see because it's dark, but if you took a flashlight and looked between those boards, you can see dirt. I mean, there's no insulation there. So, and then they also finished off the walls, put in the lighting that's there. This all happened in 1952. And then when Lee died, the first director of Pollock-Krasner House learned that underneath that white floor was this, which is the splattering of a whole lot of Pollock's paintings and most of the really famous ones. So the director hired a restoration group, restoration and preservation professionals, and they came out and removed the masonite boards and revealed this floor, so we can now see some of Pollock's splatterings. This piece actually is, after it was covered with the masonite, Pollock didn't paint a whole lot after that was done in 1952, but Lee did. And most of this is a piece of the floor that was lifted, and these are mostly Lee's. I'll show you where this was, but this is just a piece of that floor if you're interested in that. So why don't you go on in. The photography is roughly chronological, clockwise. That said, look at whatever you want. I'm going to put on some booties. Everyone have their shoes off. And I'll be right in and show you some things. Most artists have what we call a palette, which is the set of colors that they usually use. So if you think of an artist, you think, that artist uses a lot of orange, or and they'll have literally a palette, and they'll mix the colors so they can get the exact flesh tone that they want, or the exact gold and yellow for their sunflowers, or whatever it is they're painting. Pollock, for the most part, painted right out of the can. That's a great picture of him doing that right there. And these are cans of paint that Lee saved for us to see. Because of that, and never say never, but overwhelmingly, for the poor paintings, Pollock did not mix colors. The paint came right out of the can and went on the canvas. And because of that, his palette is relatively short compared to many artists. And because of that, it's really hard to tell which spot is which painting. He used all of these colors in many of his paintings, and it's really hard to tell which is which. Now, that whatever ochre or whatever color that is over there, is in a painting called Convergence, and that's probably where he did that. But the most obvious is because of this painting. This is called Blue Poles. It was done in 1952. It's owned by the Australian government. And they bought it from a guy named Heller, who bought it from Pollock. And they paid, I think it was $1.7 million. And the Australian people went nuts because how could you spend that much money on an American artist? Well, what they were trying to do was create a national gallery in Australia of international, great international art. The painting was recently evaluated for, I think they have no intention of selling it, but just for insurance purposes and so forth, at about $300 million. So I think they made a pretty good investment. Anyway, the way Pollock made these blue lines is he took a 4x4 pole, like you'd build a fence with, and he put blue paint on it and dropped it onto the canvas. And we see this right here. That's where one of the poles vertically, and then it went onto the painting. And here, and when you see that one, then you can see the others. So that's, you know, we're very confident that's how that happened. That's probably Convergence. There's a few others on here where we're pretty sure what painting was going on. But a lot of them, it's just, you know, these colors, black, white, and that ochre color, and blue are colors that are in a lot of his paintings, and who knows which splatter is what. So
He had a big piece of canvas here that all this is underneath the canvas, or?
this is a picture. I'm going to point at this, and then I'll get out of the way so you can look at it. That became a painting called 131, which is at MoMA. It's one of the largest paintings that he did. It's not the largest, but it's one. But you can see right where you're standing is the edge of it, and it goes all the way over here. So it covered most of this.
Yeah.
That painting's worth at least $300 million. And you know, to look at that, he used a sailcloth that you'd make a sail for a boat, because he knew it was going to be a big painting and heavy. So rather than canvas that, you know, a smaller painting would be fine, he used sailcloth because he knew it was going to be big and heavy. And to look at that blank piece of sailcloth and think about what it became and what it's worth now is sort of mind-blowing.
Is that during his sober period?
Yes, yes. That's one of the paintings that he did when he was sober. Okay, so people say, you know, what's the proper way to say? Is it pour paintings? Is it drip paintings? Is it splatter paintings? Most people say pour paintings, but he did all of that. So to call it drip paintings isn't wrong. To call it splatter paintings, he threw paint, he splattered it, he poured it. All of those are correct. The key thing to keep in mind is that the medium, the paint, in overwhelmingly most cases, passes through the air, the same way the sand of the Native American painting did. The paint passes through the air and then hits the canvas and finds its place. Now, Pollock is directing that and is hugely involved, but he's working in partnership with the paint. Most artists take a brush or their hand or a palette and put it on the canvas exactly where they want it. Pollock didn't do that. You can see here, I think he was 5'6", so his right hand there is about 5 feet off the ground. That paint is falling 5 feet before it gets on the canvas, and he doesn't go down and move it around. It finds its own place. So that's a way to think about how he did. And again, there are examples where he actually used a brush or sometimes his hand or a stick. So, you know, never say never, never say always. But overwhelmingly, that's how he painted, is he let the paint fall onto the surface and find its place with his action. And he was called an action painter. And when you see film of him, he was really dancing around. This painting and this rectangle also match up with they're very, very likely these two paintings are that exact size. If you want to just pass that around. Now, another interesting thing that Pollock would do is he'd have his painting, and he'd say, okay, I'm done with this. He was asked once, how do you know you're done? You know, if it's a painting of a woman or a horse, you can sort of feel, but how do you know when a Pollock is done? His answer was, it's like sex, you just know when it's done. But that really was him being a smartass, because he would frequently call Lee in and say, I think I'm done, am I done? And she would give her opinion. But anyway, when he felt he was done, he would, the way I describe it is intellectually crop his painting. Now, photographers do this all the time, but painters usually don't. He would look at the painting and he'd say, here's my painting. And then he would build a stretcher frame, that exact size, and wrap the canvas around the edges, and some of the marks that he'd made ended up on the side or in the back, because that was outside of what he wanted. And that's why all the poor paintings of Pollock's are odd sizes. They don't measure the same, like you'd buy a canvas or a 4x8. Even a lot of artists who build their own stretcher frames, they end up with fairly common sizes, not with Pollock. And next time you're in a museum, I mentioned framing. The poor paintings of Pollock are almost never framed. So you can see that. And you can see on the edge, you can see paint. And if you take the painting off, of the wall, just before they arrest you, you can see paint on the back. So that's sort of an interesting part of the way Pollock worked. So most of the, in fact, all the marks on the floor here are Pollock. Shouldn't say all, never say that. But when Lee moved over here in 1956, this white floor was down. So she never painted in here when this floor was raw like this. So it's fair to say that virtually all of these marks were Jackson Pollock's. Most of the marks on the wall, maybe all of them, most of them, are Lee's. Now she painted, when she moved over here, her paintings got much bigger, but they were traditionally done. They were vertical, done with a brush. And it's interesting, art historians have pondered. He dies in 1956, and her work, she didn't do anything for a couple of months. She was dealing with the funeral and all that. But right away, she starts doing these just stunningly beautiful pieces of art. And, you know, where's the mourning? Where's the sadness? And they were, you know, they fought all the time, but they were really a couple. They were really in love. And I'll show you a picture in the house that I think depicts that. So where is her mourning? Where is her sadness? And maybe she manifested that by creating beautiful art. This is a painting done in 1957 called Seasons. It's at the Whitney Museum in New York. I think it's just gorgeous. And you can see the edge. It was on the wall there, and that's where she painted it. And a lot of her work, as I say, it got a lot bigger because the space is a lot bigger than the room we'll see in a few minutes. But it also just got gorgeous. And why? Your guess is as good as anybody else's. But it certainly, it didn't get dark, and it didn't get what you might stereotypically think about as a mourning person. We need to go over to the house now. Again, I'm going to, thank you. I'm going to remind you, I'm sure you didn't get a chance to see everything. There's some really good pictures of Pollock. Sometimes he's down on his knees, the paint only traveling a few inches, but he almost never puts it on the canvas. He's always dropping, pouring, splattering. There's some pictures over there of them removing the masonite panels. This is his Franz Klein and Wilhelm de Kooning helped Lee with the burial process. There's some great photography of Lee that you can take a look at. But respecting the, I never do this in an hour. I always get.
Was this an earlier phase? Because here he's actually...
No, that's actually the last sort of legitimate body of work he did. Those are called the black paintings. And one of the things, he was fascinated with Picasso, who isn't. But one of the things that Pollock was very envious of is the way Picasso reinvented himself. You know, he creates, with Braque, he creates Cubism. Then he goes on to the more realistic stuff that he did right after World War I. Then he does plaster sculpture. He does metal sculpture. He does other style of painting over and over. And any one of those bodies of work would have put him in the great artist category. He just kept doing it over and over. And Pollock says, well, I think of myself as a great artist, but what's next? I've been splattering paint for 5 or 6 years now. I need to do something else. So he goes back, and if you look at those paintings, you can see a lot of figures in them. There's faces and dances, and so he's getting back to figuration. They're all black. Now, those were a critical success, and in the first show at Betty Parsons' gallery, no one bought a single one of them. And he's famous by this point. No one wanted it, which was crushing and caused more drinking. But yeah, those are not poor paintings. Those are what he's trying to do is, what do I do next? And he never really got there. So as you're finding out. This is actually a Pollock sculpture. Do you know the word cairn? It's a Scandinavian word for rock sculpture. Well, this is a rock sculpture. The sort of brown areas of grass around that you see, like over here is most obvious. Right underneath there is a boulder, and that's why the grass isn't as healthy. This is a moraine, which is the remains of a glacier. And a glacier will leave garbage, boulders, whatever. This whole area was scraped by a glacier thousands of years ago and left all these boulders here. So Pollock had a buddy who had a sort of skip loader kind of a thing, came over, and they pulled these rocks up and made this. The last picture we have of Pollock, the last day of his life, we have sitting on that far right rock with his girlfriend. And one of them is missing. It's actually Lee's headstone. So when she died, they took one of them, and that became, his headstone is a large boulder, but it's not from here. So here we are. I'm going to remind you, this feels like a home because it is, but it's also a museum, so please don't touch anything. I mentioned that the outside looks roughly the same as it did for all intents and purposes. The inside's significantly different. We think this middle room was probably 2 rooms and a hallway, or maybe even 3 rooms, and they opened that up, and they opened this. They had to leave these posts to hold the structure up, but they wanted much more of a feeling of a loft that they had been used to in the city. And when they first moved here, they brought almost nothing with them from the city. This little white bench on the porch is the only thing we know they brought, because we've seen it in pictures of the apartment where they lived in the city before they moved here. These 2 big wooden pieces were given to them by friends pretty much right away. Then Lee was very interested in furniture and antique furniture, and over the years she collected a lot of the furniture that we see in here today. The amazingly beautiful round table was acquired after Pollock died, so he never saw that. There's a photograph here on this hutch that shows a rectangular table that was here when Pollock was alive. This painting has a sort of interesting story. It's the only oil painting that we have of Pollock's, that we, meaning the house and study center. Lee had set up 2 foundations. one the Pollock-Krasner Foundation and the other the Pollock-Krasner House and Study Center Foundation. She left all of her art and his to that first foundation and none to this foundation, and also no money, which is curious. But in any case, during his lifetime, Pollock decided he wanted a will. Now, they didn't have any children and had no intention of having children, but he still wanted to know certain paintings to go to certain people and so forth. There was a lawyer who lived nearby, and he made a deal with that guy if the lawyer would write the will, Pollock would give him a painting. So they did that, and this is the painting. What happened was Pollock dies, and then the lawyer died, and sometime after that, the lawyer's wife decided that this painting belonged here, so she gave it back. So that's why we have it. There's all sorts of interesting art in here. This fish press that was caught, a friend of theirs made that impression, and then they roasted the fish and ate it. This interesting sculpture here was done by a guy named Ronald Stein, who was Lee's nephew. It's actually a fountain. You can see the little fixture on top. Each season, we have 2 art exhibits, first half of the summer and second half. And this is, you'll see work that is more modern looking by a woman who is actually a faculty member and artist at Stony Brook, State University of New York, Stony Brook. Han Chin, I hope I'm pronouncing her name properly. And this is work. And Lee did a set of paintings that she called the small paintings, because they are small. And Han said that these are inspired by that work. So that's the glue and why they're here. If we can move into this. Now, one of the myths is that Pollock listened to jazz when he was painting. He did not. We have hundreds of pictures of Pollock painting, pictures of the studio, whether he's painting or not. And in no photograph do we have any record player, no radio, nothing. They loved jazz. If please don't touch them, but if you look through those albums, there's some classic American jazz albums from the 40s and 50s. Lee and Jackson and all their friends loved American jazz and listened to it all the time, but not while they were working. I love asking young people who come through what this white thing is, and some of them don't know. In 1949, in August of 49, Pollock was in Life magazine. A lot of people think he was on the cover. He was not. But this was, some of you are old enough to remember when this was on everybody's coffee table, everybody in the United States. So having a spread like this, what really put him on the national level. And, you know, there were a lot of funny cartoons that came in the New Yorker and other places about his poor painting, because it's hard for us to understand how revolutionary that was in 1945 and 46 when he began doing it. But it was really, you know, crazy. And so he has this article, and I always have to put my glasses on because I want to read it properly. But he had problems with this subheadline that says, "Is he the greatest living painter in the United States?" So he's going, what is this question mark? And what is this United States limitation? But anyway, the artist's ego.
Are those brushes he used, or those just decorations that he put around?
I don't know. I don't know. Sort of pretty, aren't they? I have to find out. This is the work of the living artist, Han Chin. Yeah. So now we'll go upstairs. You know, we can handle, usually I break people up, but I think a couple people have peeled off. So we can go up together. So let's go up the stairs. If you go to the left and then up. So first thing you'll notice are the white floorboards. This is what the studio looked like. These are the same masonite panels. And let us into the bedroom. You may be aware that Ed Harris did a very accurate movie of Pollock. There are two glitches. The most significant is it depicts him splattering some paint on the floor in this studio here and getting the idea of pour painting, which we know from what we've discussed was planted in his head years before that. But it's a movie and they only had so much. Other than that, it's really quite accurate. And they were here filming for about 11 days in 2 chunks. They did some filming here. There were some outdoor shots that they wanted to get, and it was pouring rain, so they came back. They recreated this house on a soundstage, and it ended up, most of what ended up in the movie was the soundstage. However, all the outdoor scenes are shot here. If you recall, a delivery guy brings a big bundle of that Life magazine that I pointed out and brings it up to that door, and they used that actual scene, which was shot in the house. Most of the interior shots. And if you watch the movie again, which you might want to do, in the movie, in the set, this stairway is open to the living room, which as you can see, it's not. So if you see that, you know it's the soundstage version. It doesn't really make any difference. But other than that, the depiction of Peggy Guggenheim, you know, Marcia Gray Harden got an Academy Award for depiction of Lee, and it's a wonderful performance. Ed Harris looked like Pollock. They didn't have to make him up that much, and was obsessed with researching the film. It's really quite something. So let's go in the bedroom. So this was their bedroom. One of the things that you'll see downstairs and up here, they were really hunters and gatherers. They would go on walks on the beach and collect shells, rocks. I don't know if you noticed the anchor on the wall. They found that on the beach one day. And so they would bring back and decorate the house with that. Interestingly, when they lived here together, they had twin beds, which I thought was a little curious. And then I remembered that my parents had twin beds, and I have an older brother and a younger sister, and somehow that happened. So I guess the distance is traversable. Anyway, interestingly, I thought for a while that Lee had made these boxes, but she didn't. There's like, what do you get Lee Krasner for her birthday? Her friends would make these boxes out of shells and give them to her, and she really prized those. I love the little Sony TV over there. This gown that I'm standing in front of was made for her. In 1967, there was a retrospective of Pollock's work, and thinking about, he died in '56, so this is only 11 years after his death, and they're already doing a retrospective at MoMA of his work, which gives you a little, if you needed it, a little substantiation for his fame and importance in the art community. But anyway, this designer made this dress for Lee, and this is a picture of her wearing the dress at the retrospective. That's the curator who did the exhibit. This portrait was done by a guy named Pentecoff. There we go. He was her boyfriend before she met Pollock. And some people have asked, was that up when Pollock was here? And the answer is no. But she put it back up. There's another of his work. I don't know his work I don't know it well at all. But I think this is the only good thing he ever did, because I'll show you the other one that looks like a moderately talented high school student. But this is the really important room, so let's go on in here. This is really the important room up here. When they first moved here, Pollock painted in here for 6 or 8 months until they got the studio moved over there. And it was a fisherman's, the guy that lived here before was a fisherman, and all sorts of tackle and junk in there apparently. So it took a while to get that all out and get it set up so that he could paint in there. During that time, he painted in this room. And Lee told us that the first time he ever painted on the floor was right here. And he did a small painting. It's called The Key, and it's at the Art Institute of Chicago. And it's a traditional brush-painted painting. It's about this big. It's framed. When he painted it, these masonite tiles were not down yet. And I'm told, I've never stood in front of the key, but I'm told that you can see impressions from the floorboard. As he painted, he picked up some of the floorboard underneath here in the painting, which you probably wouldn't notice if you weren't looking for it. But in any case, it was, you know, traditionally painted with a brush. It's easel size, but Lee told us it's the first time he ever painted on the floor here. So then he moves over into the studio 6 or 8 months, and then Lee painted in here for basically 10 years, from 46 to 56 when he dies. And she did some wonderful work, but it's all, you know, easel size. I mean, you can't really do a very big painting in here. It's a lovely room. It's got nice light, a very inspiring view. Frequently, visitors will take a picture of that window, sort of like a Magritte image. And but there's the native people around here. We Westerners call them the Acabonic. The mascot at East Hampton High School is the Bonnickers. And she painted a series of paintings which she called the Acabonic series, which is one of her really special bodies of work that she painted in this room. Then she moves over into the studio in 1957, and in my humble opinion, her work gets clearly bigger. That's not opinion, but I think much more inspired. I like her work that was done in the studio. That sketch over there is the other one I was going to point out. That's there, yeah, right, which I think is far less inspired than the one in the bedroom.
Where's most of her work? Is it spread around?
Spread around. The MoMA has a significant collection. Interestingly, Philadelphia Museum has a fair number of her work, and a number of private collectors. A friend of mine actually owns, I think, 5 of her pieces. He says that Pollock had an orgasm and Lee had a career, because she painted for many years, and you know he had his poor thing for 6 or 8 years, and that was that. Anyway, I feel like burning my tongue saying that. Anyway, so that's basically my story. Any questions or?
Thank you.
If,
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
my pleasure. My pleasure. Glad you came.